An intuition, generally defined, is something we can understand instinctively without having to use conscious reasoning. We value something that is intuitive because it allows us to spend less time consciously thinking about something. Let's spend less time and energy thinking about something, freeing up those resources for more important things, which in an RPG I would say would be something like role-playing. When something is intuitive, it feels right. But what exactly is going on there? What does it mean to feel right? What is going on when we have an intuition about something? Archaically, we conceive of our feelings and instincts coming from like our body, a gut feeling, for example, and our thoughts being in our head. But outside of some, dialogue between your body and your brain through hormones and so on, ultimately it's all going on inside the brain. What we've colloquially called thoughts are actually conscious thoughts, and what we've colloquially called feelings are just unconscious thoughts. They're all still thoughts, though. Intuitions, then, are when we can understand something with unconscious mental processes, meaning we don't also have to waste energy consciously processing those things as well. And they're actually faster than our conscious thoughts because they're performed by parts of our brain that are specialized to do that one thing really well. In a modern recording studio, for example, there will be a computer that records all the audio, and the audio engineer can load up his computer with plugins, effects, reverb, compressors, stuff like that. But each of these things that he loads in there takes up a bit of the processing power of the computer. Or he can pump the signal out into real racked hardware bits of gear, outboard gear, that does the same thing, but it frees up the processing power of the computer to do the recording part of it. Our unconscious mental processes are like the outboard gear of our conscious mind. And if we can use them to take care of things like, let's say, dice mechanics and math and stuff like that, then it frees up our conscious processes to do the thing that we're really there to do, to role play. But in order for us to design mechanics that utilize these modules in our brain, we need to know what they are and what their capabilities are and how they work. Well, luckily enough, we have some research from neuroscience and psychological science that can give us some insight into how that works. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over how humans instinctively understand the mathematical parts relevant to TTRPGs that I've arranged into a list of things that I call the virtues of mathematical intuitiveness in TTRPGs. I may have to think a little harder about that acronym. But before I do, I want to make something clear. If you're a budding game designer and you get through my list of virtues and you look at your mechanic and you didn't get like any of them, you'll probably have one of two reactions. Either you'll say, oh no, my mechanic is unintuitive. Or probably more likely, you'll say, no, my mechanic is great. This guy on the internet he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's an idiot. Psychology is a sham and so on. So this is not a bingo card that you have to fill out in order to get an intuitive mechanic. In fact, I think it's probably the case that that's impossible. It's impossible to have a perfectly intuitive mechanic because mechanics will never truly capture the essence of the thing that we're using them to represent, well, and still be usable to us. There are good reasons, there are going to be good reasons to defy each and every one of these virtues, which we'll go over some of them. So please put the pitchfork down. This is not a personal attack on you. And the intuitiveness of your mechanic is not a representative of your worth as a person, okay? My intent here is more that if you got two mechanics that you're kind of weighing up to two ways to do something, then maybe you'll be able to look at them in regard to these virtues, other things taken to be the same, and go, this one actually scores better on the virtues. Maybe this one's going to feel more intuitive at the table. That's all. So let's get into it. My name is Matt. Welcome to the Tomb of Lime. Okay, virtue number 0, because I don't really think it's too useful and it doesn't warrant being on the list properly, is that math is hard and it takes up energy and we'd prefer not to do any of it at all. However, math is just invariably going to end up being part of how we simulate or emulate an imaginary world and how we run the imaginary world. So in the case that we need to use math, these are the virtues that are going to help us make it more intuitive. Number 1, additive thinking. In 1952, Jean-Paul Piaget did some experiments on some kids, classic psychology stuff, and he was discovering his project was the stages of development. But one of the insights, a couple of insights he had were mathematical. And one of them was that the kids learn addition before they learn subtraction. And that's just the order in which humans learn them. This actually extends into adulthood as well, as we have found that human beings prefer additive thinking over subtractive thinking. They will tend to use addition to solve a problem, even if subtraction would be more efficient to do so. I think this is probably because at least parts of our brain are very focused on the concrete, the real, not the abstract. And so it's easy for us to intuitively think of things in their concrete form, like, the classic maths problems that start with things like, Timmy has 5 oranges. It's pretty simple for us to think about, hey, Timmy eats an orange. Okay, he has 4 oranges. But when we separate out that -1 and abstract it, okay, then we're faced with a much stranger question, which is, what is a negative orange? Whatever the reason is, if you have an arbitrary way to do a mechanic, either using addition or subtraction, you will get slightly more mileage out of addition than you will out of subtraction. Because humans will just tend to additive solutions to problems just as by the course of the way that our brains work. Number 2, accumulation. Now, humans do prefer to work with smaller numbers because it's less processing power required to deal with it. However, they experience gains and losses differently from each other. A +2 and a -2 might be mathematically equivalent, but to our brains, they are different. This comes from something called prospect theory. And basically, this says that humans are more likely to choose to not receive a loss rather than accept a gain of equivalent amounts. That is, they feel that losses hurt more than gains are good. But when faced with the choice of gaining more of a good thing rather than losing more of a bad thing that you already have, they gravitate to accumulating good things. The reason that points and high score in video games are a big, massive positive number rather than the reduction in some negative thing, for example, is because humans prefer to accumulate things. Perhaps this is out of some hunter-gatherer type instinct, or perhaps it's to do with our inability to properly conceive of negative numbers, like I mentioned before. But whatever the reason is, again, we prefer accumulating stuff, getting stuff. Now, roll under systems, right? They're mathematically elegant. However, I think we can all remember a point at which we learned that the person playing golf with the least points was the winner, and that being unintuitive. I think humans would naturally have a preference to big stat equals good stat and high roll equals good roll. Mathematically, they might be the same, but if you can find a way to frame the mechanic around accumulation, more thing equals better, big thing equals better, then it will be slightly more intuitive. Number 3, 4 magic chunks. So psychologist George Miller is credited with coming up with this number, the number 7 ±2, for how many discrete things you can hold in your short-term memory at once. And this is sometimes called Miller's Law. We found that this differs depending on what information it is, what kind of information it is that you're storing in there, like numbers or words or whatever. So it's more complicated than 7 ±2. Some people have pointed out that humans do what is called chunking. That is, we take a string of information and we group it so that it's less burdensome, like there's less discrete objects that can help us remember it. For example, if we're memorizing a phone number, we might turn 555, which is 3 discrete pieces of information, into 555. 555, that's 2 discrete pieces of information. And I suppose turning a long string of chunks into long-term memory can offload it out of our short-term memory, our conscious brain usage. For example, by memorizing a procedure for how to do something in your game, might end up allowing us to store more information in that regard. But other critics have gone the other way. They've said, well, look, if you can't chunk, if we make sure that the people in our experiments can't chunk the information, then actually the number of discrete objects that we can hold in our short-term memory at once actually drops to something like 4. So one example is up to the level of the number 4 discrete objects, humans could do something that is called subitizing. That is, you can instantly count how many objects there are just in an instant. We have a part of our brain that's use is to subitize that information, to count those small numbers. So I would say that if you want to keep your mathematical mechanics within the cognitive thresholds, the subconscious, unconscious, the intuitive thresholds of the human brain, I would actually keep everything under 4 discrete objects at once. For example, maybe if there's more than 4 steps in resolving an action, or if there's more than 4 sources of modifiers onto your dice roll, or whatever it is, if you can keep it under 4, you're going to do much better for the human brain. I call this when you roll a dice and then you've got to keep a bunch of modifiers in your brain after the roll. I call that the dance of the modifiers, because you keep going up and down, and as someone remembers another thing that affects the roll, you have to go more and less and more and less. There's more than 4 places you need to go to check what your result really is. You're probably straining the limits of what we can do intuitively. I mean, ideally, actually, I'd prefer there to be none. I like mechanics where the roll, what you see on the table, is the end result, and you can instantly know whether you've succeeded or failed. But, if you have to. 4, comparison is easier than counting. Above the limit of the 4 items that we can subitize, that is, rapidly count without consciously counting them, another system kicks in called the approximate number system, or ANS. There appears to be a module in the brain that's basically there from birth, and it even exists in animals. But basically, above the limit of 4, counting things is hard. But our ANS is able to compare 2 things and tell which one is higher than the other very rapidly. A group of saber-toothed tigers goes into the caveman's cave, then a group of saber-toothed tigers comes out of the caveman's cave. Well, is it safe to go into the cave? So mechanics that ask you to compare 2 things are going to be quicker than asking you to look at a number and then count and add or subtract or whatever it is to get to the result. I think this is one of the reasons that the advantage mechanic is so widely taken up, because 2 dice roll, it's very quick to be able to compare those 2 and see which one is higher. And it seems to be way faster, at least, than setting a DC or changing a modifier. And I think maybe this is kind of a bit of an admission to some degree that setting DCs is just not that intuitive. There is a limit to how accurate your ANS can be. Here, I will flash 2 images on the screen for you. Bing, 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 boom. Now, it would have been too fast for you to be able to count the number of dots in those boxes. However, if you were pressed to guess which one had more in it, you'd have a very high likelihood of getting it right, so long as the number of dots was at least 15% different from each other. So we can very quickly compare things without having to count them, so long as the interval between those 2 things is at least 15%. And as an aside, the difference between the numbers of dots on a D6 from side to side is 16.666%. So just saying. Number 5, just noticeable difference. Now, that 15% difference is not just for your ANS. There are other parts of the brain that seem to operate at similar interval. It does vary depending on how big the number is, but as a general rule, the difference that humans can perceive of probability between 2 things is about that interval as well. People describe percentile systems as being intuitive. I don't think, strictly speaking, they are. I think what's going on here is that before, we dealt with percentages, you probably just dealt with fractions. And as our fractions got higher and higher and more complicated, comparing 2 fractions when both the top and bottom number could move up and down became very, very complicated. So they decided to pick a standard. All right, let's make the bottom half of the fraction, underneath the fraction, be a 100. And just standardize. That way you just have to compare the top number. And like I said, comparison is easier than counting. So certainly, percentages are much more intuitive than dealing with massive fractions. But why the number 100 in particular was picked as opposed to any other number, why we use base 10 in the first place, I don't know, our number of fingers, I don't know, whatever it is. It may just be convention. It may have been something in particular that they were doing with the math at the time when they came up with it. I don't know. But even now, people will generally look at a percentage and kind of round it to a near usable fraction, a fraction that is, as low as is reasonable. And kids are going to learn fractions before they learn percentages. It's just, yeah. Since we talk about probabilities in percentages generally, it is tempting to use that as the basis for your system in the first place. But be warned of our just noticeable difference. If there is anything in your D100 game that changes the probability of something by less than, at the very least 10%, okay, then it's not significant as far as the human perception of probability is concerned, and I would strongly question the necessity and utility of a percentage change that small. Just because you've been given 100 degrees of resolution for your mechanic does not mean you need to use every single one. So in summary, additive thinking is easier than subtractive thinking. Accumulation is preferable to loss reduction. Keep chunks to 4 or less if possible. Comparison is easier than counting for numbers above 4, as long as your intervals are at least 15%. And any change in probability below 10% is insignificant. So the biggest limitation in my mind to these virtues is that I think it's hard to measure just how much of a difference they make. So let's say additive thinking is more intuitive than subtractive thinking. Okay, how much more intuitive? I don't know, and I'm not sure how easy it is to measure something like that. It might just be a case-by-case basis, depending on what you're dealing with. So my advice would be to keep these things in mind, but don't treat them like ironclad rules of game design. If you're going to subvert one of them, then make sure it's for a reason, because it's going to cost your game in one way. Just make sure you make up with it in another. Now, you might think that with neuroscience and psychological science on our side, now we can come up with the most intuitive game mechanic ever, some new revolutionary thing that's going to change the way we deal with mechanics in role-playing games. But I think we already are doing this. I don't think game devs have these principles written, on a poster on their wall, like motivating them. But I think games over the last 30, 40, 50 years have been slowly converging on these rules just naturally in this sort of Darwinian competitive way. Mechanics come along, we try them, we leave them behind, we keep some, and so on. Now, I should mention too that this video has been dealing with mathematical intuitiveness. That's not the only aspect of intuitiveness that we deal with for an RPG. Another way that we sort of use the word intuitiveness when it comes to RPGs is talking about basically how well the mechanic corresponds to the thing in the fiction that it represents. That's outside of the scope of this video right now, I think. But suffice to say, as long as your mechanics, as long as the results of your dice rolls and things like that don't break our sense of what the fictional world should really be. They don't strain it, take us out of the fiction by how zany the results end up being, then you're probably well on your way. So I can see it now. People are going to ask, what dice mechanic do I think is the most intuitive one out there? I've given you all these virtues, okay, all right? So you tell me. But I will say that I like the humble D6 for this, It's especially the one that has pips on it rather than numerological picture. The number of pips on the dice is not just a symbol that means a number, it is the number. There are that number of concrete pips on the dice, which means that at a glance, intuitively, the first 4 sides of that D6 we can subitize, and then the other 2 sides are a great enough difference for our A&S to be able to compare them, and for our just noticeable difference. So that's not a bad start. Oh, and you want to know what mechanic I use in the RPG I've been making? Because the one that I've built based on these very principles that I've been talking about. Oh, look at the time. This video is getting long enough already. Well, it's too bad. My name's Matt. This is the Tomb of Lime. Thanks for listening. Bye.